Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome to a new tutorial video. Now, as you may know, I have been working on a portable layout for a while now, and one of the questions I get asked a lot is how do I align the tracks when I join up the baseboard so that everything runs smoothly? Now, this is crucial for those of you who, like me, are building a portable or exhibition style layout that needs to easily come apart for storage or transportation. But it may also be useful for permanent layouts too. For example, if you have a section that crosses in front of a doorway, you might want to have a hinged opening so that you can get through. Now, previously I've done a video where I showed you how to join the actual baseboards together, but today we're just going to focus on the track. How do you make the join smooth enough so that even your most fussy locos and rolling stock will cross between the boards without derailing or jumping off? And once you've achieved that, how do you blend it all together to make the join as seamless as possible? Well, all that is coming up in today's video, but just before we get started, this is a great time to remind you that I've just launched channel memberships for those of you who want to get an exclusive behind the scenes look at what I'm working on for upcoming videos and also the modular layout. It's also great actually for tutorials like this one too, because if you have any further questions afterwards, you basically have a hotline to me where you can ask as much as you want and can even suggest topics too for future videos that you'd like to see. Anyway, if you're interested in that, click on the join button down below this video on desktop, and now let's head over to the layout and get on with today's tutorial. So here's our starting point with two baseboards ready to have track laid on them. Now, in previous videos, I've gone over how I actually align the baseboards and get them to lock together consistently, so today we're just going to focus mostly on the track. You can see I've already got a layer of cork glued down, and we're going to have two tracks cross over this join between the two baseboards. I would say that even if you're predominantly using set track for your layout, in my opinion it's much easier to use flexible track for crossing the baseboard joints. You can just use a small section over the joint itself, then go back to the set track pieces afterwards, but with the flexi track being a little less rigid, it's much easier to manipulate and also remove the sleepers. Speaking of removing the sleepers, that's really the first step here, and with the track roughly in the right position, I'm going to mark the ones that I want to remove. Now, I'm marking a few for removal on each side of the joint here, just to make things a little bit easier for myself in the future. And then it comes to actually removing the sleepers. Simply flip the track over and cut the plastic webbing between the sleepers using a craft blade. After this, you should be able to just pull off all the sleepers you want to remove as one big chunk. Hold on to these though, as you may want to reinstate some of them once the track is back in place, or you could even use them to make up a nice pile of sleepers beside your track somewhere. Now, you may be wondering why exactly I've removed the sleepers to create this ugly looking gap, but that's because we're going to solder the rails to some brass screws that we embed into the baseboard. As you can see, I'm marking the position of both rails on either side of the joint, and this will give me a good idea of where to place the screws. Using a drill, we then just make some pilot holes for the screw to go into, and then once that's done, we can start putting our brass screws in place. These need to be tightened up until they're sitting just slightly above the layer of the cork. The idea is that the rail will sit on top of these screws, so they need to be at roughly the same height of the sleepers. And once I've done this on one side of the join, I then need to repeat the process for the side nearest the camera. When it comes to making your pilot holes and putting the screws in, you want to make sure that these are opposite the screws on the other baseboard. With all the screws in place, let's bring our track back in and see how flat it lies. And you might just be able to tell that on the line at the back there, one of the screws is just a little bit too high, so I'm going to tighten that up a bit more. And there we go, the track is now nice and flat without any unwanted bumps. So now let's move on to the next step where we actually fit it in place. So back to the workbench, the next step is to add a little bit of solder to the undersides of the rails. I'm doing this in 2 places on each rail in roughly the position where each of the screws will sit. And then heading back to the layout, I'm also adding solder to the top of the brass screws as well. The idea with this, of course, is to solder the rails to the tops of the screws. This will hold the rails in position and stop them from moving out of alignment in the future. We can now put the track back in place, and this time you want to actually use fish plates to connect it up to the previous section. Now, if you're not very good at soldering, like I am, then blobs of solder will push the track up slightly, but don't worry, we'll sort this out in a moment. With the track in place, heat the solder up on one of the screws and then gently push the rail down into it. You can see as the solder melts on the screw, the track is now free to move down to meet it. And then as I take the soldering iron away, it cools and the rail is locked into place. So with the rails soldered fast to our brass screws either side of the joint, it's now time to fix down the rest of our track. For you, this may only be a very short section to cross the gap, but for me, I'm making the most of these long lengths of flexi track for my station. You don't need to do anything in particular here, just lay the track as you normally would. For me, that involves using a pin drill to make a little hole through the sleeper and then hammering a track pin into place. And the last time I showed this process on camera, I got a lot of very angry comments saying I shouldn't use a hammer this big and that I needed to use a special track pin one instead, so I wonder how many angry comments I'm going to get this time. Anyway, back to the baseboard joint, we now have our track over where the 2 boards meet and the rails on either end are firmly secured. But as these are just single pieces of track still, we can't actually separate the boards yet, so we need to cut them apart. For this, I like to use a Dremel with a slitting disc and simply cut each of the rails. And you can see the brass screws we soldered them to earlier hold them in place nicely so that the alignment stays exactly where we want them to. This means when I separate the 2 baseboards and rejoin them, the rails will always match back up with each other. And as you can see when I run my finger over the joints now, we have a small gap between the rails, but the height and the alignment is still spot on. Just to prove the point, here is a few carriages going over the joints. There's no derailments because the track is still perfectly aligned, and there's no bumps either from one board to the other. And that's because we soldered the track in place and then cut it afterwards. So that's all good, end of the video, right? Well, actually, there's still a couple of things that we need to address. So at this point we have the tracks all nicely aligned, and we know that if we take the baseboards apart and put them back together again, everything should still line up. We also know that our rolling stock can move over the joint nice and smoothly without derailing. But remember that in those previous clips I was simply pushing the carriages by hand rather than having a loco pull them across. Now that's because before we can do that we need to think about how we're going to transfer power from one baseboard across to the next. Now normally when we clip pieces of track together, the fish plates transfer the power along to the next rail, but seeing as we don't have fish plates on the tracks at the end of our boards, that isn't going to work. Now, you might think that it's simply just a case of adding the fish plates to one side of the joint, and you could do that, but it's going to be really tricky to try and line up both sets of fish plates correctly and then push them in at the same time while also trying to align the baseboard. It's going to get frustrating really quickly. And probably after a few times you're going to end up bending or damaging the fish plates anyway. But don't worry, because there is a much easier way. Now my layout is wired for both analog and DCC operation, and I've got a power bus that runs underneath all of the baseboards on my layout. This is essentially 2 wires, one positive and one negative, that connects to my track at various intervals. When it gets to the end of the baseboard though, I need the power to transfer across, so all I do is add a simple push-fit connector to my 2 wires. Then on the other baseboard, I have another power bus with the opposite connector at the end, and the 2 just simply join together. Now the power can flow from one board through to the next, and depending on how simple or complex your setup is, this works with both analog and DCC. And here is how this works in reality. As you can see, connecting the boards electrically is as simple as pushing the connectors together. Now, if you don't have a power bus running underneath your layout, don't worry, you could still use this technique. Instead, simply take the power from the last piece of track and drill holes through the baseboard so that the wires can pass underneath. Repeat this on the opposite baseboard and again use the connectors to pass the power through. Do be aware though that if you're using analog power and have multiple tracks crossing the join that you want to control separately, then you'll need a new set of wires for each line. This means that the tracks are only connected to their opposite partner and each line can be controlled individually. So that takes care of the wiring, but now we need to look at how to blend the join together to make it as seamless as possible. Well, what do we always have around our track? Ballast. Now, ballasting can be a tedious task at the best of times, but doing it so close to the edge of the board means that there's an added extra risk that the ballast and glue will all just fall off the edge and end up on the floor. Well, luckily I've got a technique that I use that not only prevents this, but keeps the joins nice and flush as well, so that the gap between the boards is almost invisible. So we're back on the layout, and as you can see, things have moved on slightly from when I laid the track. We've got a set of platforms now. At the end of the station, the track is still nicely aligned, but like I said, now we need to ballast it, and I've got a little trick up my sleeve for this. That trick is masking tape. All I'm going to do is take a strip of it and stick it along the end of the baseboard. The idea being that when we put the ballast down, it'll stop it from all falling over the edge. I do this on the other baseboard as well, as it does work better if you do the two boards when they're separated. I'm also going to show you two different techniques you can use for this as well. Now, the first one, which is my preferred way of doing it, is just to ballast your track as normal. Tip some ballast onto the track, then use a brush to spread it all out. For the very ends of the board, just sprinkle a little bit of ballast over the last few sleepers, but don't go mad here. You don't want to have a huge pile of excess. And of course, just use the brush again to move it off the sleepers and fill in any gaps where the baseboard or cork is showing through. You may notice as well at this point that I've added an extra sleeper at the very end of each of the tracks too. I forgot to film it, but all I did was took a couple of those spare sleepers we cut away earlier, removed the chairs with a blade and then just pushed them into place under the rails. The glue we're about to add in a moment will hold them in place. Speaking of glue, let's move on to that. I first use a mister to spray a bit of water over first. Some people like to use IPA or water with a drop of washing up liquid in, but personally I found it didn't make much difference for me, so I just stick with good old tap water. Then the watered down PVA is added with a syringe, and generally I stay away from the very edges of the baseboard. It doesn't matter if the glue spreads naturally into those areas, but you don't want to flood it just yet. Like I said, this is pretty much my standard ballasting technique, so if you want to see a more in-depth video on that, then click the link at the top right of the video now. Once you've got the majority of the glue down, just go right to the very end of the board and simply add 1 or 2 drops, which will be plenty. It'll spread out nicely without flooding the whole area. And then we can leave this all to dry while we get on with the other baseboard. Now, this second technique I use is for those of you who are a little bit nervous about flooding the whole area with glue. You can see I've already ballasted most of the track here, but I've left a little area untouched at the very end. All I'm going to do is add some neat PVA using a brush between the sleepers and the two tracks. You'll want a fairly fine brush for this so you can get between the sleepers easily. As you can imagine though, this does take quite a bit of time, so you really don't want to be using this technique on a large area. Really, it's just for the very ends of the board. Once the glue is down, then sprinkle small amounts of ballast on top. Unfortunately, this shot is absolutely terrible because my hand is completely in the way, but as you can imagine, I didn't really have the option of going back and filming it again. Anyway, afterwards, just use a clean brush to move the excess ballast off the sleepers and away from any detail you may have like point rodding. Once you've done that, your ballast should look pretty much finished, but we definitely need to give it plenty of time to dry, so I'll come back in a bit and show you the results. Okay, so here we are the following morning, the ballast has dried nicely overnight, and now it's time to remove the tape. This is a very satisfying moment as we peel this away, and some of the excess ballast does come away with the tape, but most of it stays on the layout where we want it. If you've got any little bits of ballast stuck to the top of the sleepers like I have, just use your thumb to rub them away, they should come off fairly easily. And as you can see, the masking tape has provided us with a nice flat edge for the ballast that's in line with the edge of the baseboard. Now though, it's time to remove the tape from the other board, and you might think that this will be a bit more tricky, seeing as we flooded the whole area with glue on this one. In reality though, it's just as easy. We peel away the tape and the odd grain comes off, but mostly the result is exactly the same. Again, the tape has provided us with a really nice clean edge, so now we just have to see how well the two boards fit together. So here we go. And as you can see, there are no issues at all. In fact, if you couldn't see the split in the platforms and were just looking at the ballast, I think it's really hard to tell that there's a join here at all. There's really just a small gap in the rails, but that's it really. And just to prove the point, you can see the two boards come apart nice and easily, and then everything slots back together and the track is still nicely aligned. With everything plugged in, let's just run a train over the joints, and here comes one of my austerities with a freight train which is made up of some of my more fussy wagons, shall we say. As you can see though, they all make it over the baseboard join without any issues at all, and because there's power to both boards, the train keeps on moving. So I hope this video has been useful for those of you building layouts with sections that need to come apart, and of course this has all been part of my own modular model railway build. You can catch up on my previous updates for that project, or like I said earlier, you could even become a channel member if you want to see extra behind the scenes content on the layout before anyone else. That's going to be it for today though, so if you haven't already, please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to see notifications for future uploads. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!